Wayne Wood is the historian at large for the Jacksonville Historical Society. He is the founder of Riverside Avondale Preservation. He is well known as an advocate for historic preservation and for the stewardship of Jacksonville's history more generally and its many stories. He is sometimes referred to in media commentary as Jacksonville's most interesting man. I always learn a thing or two from him, and the rest of us, along with me, will learn something from him this evening. So with that, I'd say welcome, Wayne, and thanks very much for joining us for this speaker series event.
Well, thank you so much, Alan. It's what a pleasure to be here and to see so many friends and colleagues on this Zoom meeting. And we're going to have fun. To begin our celebration of our city's 200th anniversary, let's go back to a place long, long ago and far, far away. Let's begin with a miracle. 147 years ago this morning, an errant ray of light from the sun came streaking toward the earth at 186,000 miles per hour and struck a little boy standing on Bay Street in Jacksonville. A tourist trade photographer named Chandler Seaver had his bulky wooden camera out and a tripod set up, looking west down the unpaved muddy streets. And from beneath the black camera cloth draped over Seaver's head, he looked through the lens at the upside down image of a boy squinting in the sun. Just as that ray of light hit the boy, the photographers squeezed the bulb that opened the shutter, allowing the light to ricochet off the boy to pass through the camera's lens. In a process that seems magical even today, that image and that moment were fixed on a photographic plate deep inside the camera. It was a miracle. Maybe the boy had been curious and just walked up to see what the man was doing with this strange fancy camera, or maybe Seaver saw artistic possibilities in this charming little boy wearing a lopsided hat with one pant leg rolled up and one rolled down and holding tightly onto a wooden box under his arm. Perhaps the photographer gave the boy a penny and asked him to hold very, very, very still. Over the following weeks, Seaver made numerous copies of this image as a stereo view card, which sold quite well with a tourist, and a copy of it was purchased by a visitor from New Jersey. Over a century later, the great-grandson of that New Jersey tourist found an old photo in a box in an attic. He put it up for sale on eBay.com, and I bought it for $33.50, returning that picture to the original hometown. It's a miracle. Mm-hmm. I scanned that picture on my Epson 4000 scanner and adjusted the contrast of their detailed image in Photoshop. Then I uploaded it into PowerPoint, and right now I'm showing it to you via the internet on Zoom. It is a miracle. The boy on Bay Street lives on in this image of crystalline time through a series of cosmic, chemical, and digital miracles. He demands that we look at him, marvel at his eternal youth, and ponder who he was and what he did in the time before and after that fateful moment he was struck by that ray of light 147 years ago. The boy on Bay Street has achieved a sort of digital immortality. Now, this happened because of a Frenchman named Louis Daguerre, whose photography invention came to the United States in 1839. It was a miracle. Oliver Wendell Holmes declared that the daguerreotype, his invention, was a mirror with a memory. I love that term, a mirror with a memory. To me, a photograph is a moment of light. The early photographs required holding very still for up to 60 seconds or even more because of the nature of the photographic process and the lenses of that time. And you can see here a head clasp of a man having his portrait taken, which was to ensure that the photograph came out reasonably clearly. Daguerreotypes were made with a silver-plated copper attached to a glass, and they had to be viewed by holding them just the right angle so you could see the image on it. And by the early 1850s, they were replaced by another form of photography, less expensive, called an ambrotype, which would be viewed at any angle. The earliest known photo of Jacksonville is this ambrotype portrait of William J. Mills, who was Jacksonville's first mayor from 1832 to 1835. This is one of the rarest images in all of the Jacksonville Historical Society's archives. And the remarkable picture dates from about 1855, long after he was mayor, but it was barely 16 years after photography was invented and introduced in this country. Mills' term began in 1832 when the town finally incorporated, as Alan mentioned a while ago, and the population had soared to approximately 100 residents. Ambrotypes were typically held in little leatherette cases embossed like this. You can see compared to the size of a penny how big they were. And when you open them, the miracle of photography occurred. An image of a person, in this case, with a little velvet lining and a gold frame around him in the daguerreotype taste, just treasured by the people who had this. You could only make one of them. There was not a film print. You could print them over and over again. It was a one-time shot. But you can see from this hand-colored image up close the detail and the beauty of these images. That again, as we go through my little program here, we'll see that every one of these is a singular work of art that perhaps could be put on any museum wall in the country as true photographic treasures. Now, by the 1860s, a new type of photography came along called a carte de visite. And these were business-sized cards that could be printed over and over again. In fact, you can see from this business card, they were as cheap as $1 a dozen. And by the time of the Civil War, these were very common, and the soldiers who fought in the battle for both the North and South carried pictures of their loved ones with them to the battlefield. And the fact now is that anyone could have their likeness taken. In the centuries prior, only wealthy people who could afford to have their portraits painted by an artist could have their image preserved after they died. But with the invention of photography and the inexpensive reproduction of them, people lived on long after they died with their images. And very quickly, carte de visites were in every household in America. And the family album was born. By the time of the Civil War and afterward, nearly every family in America had a family album with everyone from the generations previous to the generations of the future encased in this album. And that was the theme of a book that I did for the Historical Society back in 2005, the Jacksonville Family Album, with the idea would be this would capture images of our family, the people who lived over the time that Jacksonville has been a city. And our goal was not just to show off the images of from the Jacksonville Historical Society's fabulous archive, but we went all over the country to museums and libraries and collections and went through over 40,000 photos to gather the very best pictures of Jacksonville to go in this book. There are still a few of these left in print, and Kate will tell you afterwards how you can get one if you don't have one. It's truly one of the best books I've ever done. It weighs 7.5 pounds and has over 600 of Jacksonville's greatest photographs in it, some of which we'll see in the process of this program tonight. So after the Civil War, a new type of photography came along. It was called a tintype, and these were printed on metal, so they weren't quite as fragile, although the emulsion did tend to degrade fairly quickly. But the coolest of all the tintypes that I've seen in collecting these photos was this one, a picture of Lem Turner. Now, this striking image was taken soon after the Civil War of Lem Turner. Yes, he's the guy you see on the signs, and he was a ferry boat operator at what is now Lem Turner Road in the Trout River. If you look up close, his piercing blue eyes looks through time at us, and the image and his name puts a modern trip to the airport on I-95 into a whole new perspective. Now, the second oldest photo we've been able to find is this one. This was a cabinet card. Cabinet cards are a little bigger than carte de visite, and they were on coffee tables and in cabinets of the Victorian era. But this picture is interesting because it shows the Inn Taylor House on the corner of Bay and Market Streets. The Blackstone building is there today. It turns out that Taylor House was actually previously owned by Jacksonville founder Isaiah D. Hart. This two-story boarding house was called Hart's Inn. It was built in 1830, and it was advertised by Hart as having furnished accommodations for people who wanted to spend the winter in Jacksonville. In 1848, Hart sold the inn to Maria Taylor, who renamed it Taylor House. And we know that in this picture from previous records, that Hart's home was right next to his inn. So one of the houses on either the right or left side of this was actually Hart's house. And this picture has been sitting there for all these years, and we recently finally figured out what it was. It's an amazing picture. It's also amazing that there's no photograph or even a painting of the founder of Jacksonville, Isaiah D. Hart, that I know of in existence. And if anybody out there has one or know where one is, I will give them $100 cash if you bring me that photo, because I would love to see a picture of what Isaiah D. Hart looks like. Now, during the Civil War, photography was really well developed. And here you see a beautiful ambrotype of 3 Union officers stationed in Jacksonville in December of 1864. And this is from the fabulous collection of Dickie Ferry, who's one of the greatest Civil War historians for Northeast Florida. And here you see the Union soldiers with a young African-American boy, his assistant, no doubt, handing him his pipe, wonderfully captured that we can see through time. Now, there are very few pictures actually taken of Confederate soldiers. Here you see a rare ambrotype of a Confederate soldier. We don't know his name, but we know he was from one of the Georgia regiments. And there were very few of them because there just weren't very many photographers left when, at least in Northeast Florida, when the Civil War began and the fighting became quite fierce. Here you see a regiment of Confederate soldiers. Is the only other one I know of that exists. But there were lots of pictures of Union soldiers, thanks to a man named Samuel Cooley. Here you see his sign on a store in downtown Jacksonville. This was the Sutler store, kind of a general store where the local citizens as well as the military could come and buy general goods. And Cooley had his photo studio set up in this building. And he went on to take dozens of photographs of Jacksonville. And the reason they're so important is not only because they're very artistically done, but also they were taken on glass plate negatives, which can be easily reproduced at very high resolution, resulting in these images that we see today. And here's one you see of the city market at the foot of Ocean Street. It was the center of activity with Union troops. Here you see 2 boats unloading soldiers and supplies. And the one in the center of the picture is the paddle wheeler USS Cosmopolitan. Dr. Theodore Hartridge was a physician who came to Jacksonville in the 1850s. And during the Civil War, the Confederate troops seized his building to use as their provost house. And when the Union soldiers took it over, and this picture taken by Cooley in 1864, it had become the commissary for Union troops. And in this rear photo, you see Union soldiers from the 34th U.S. Colored Troops. And if you look at the building closely, you'll see the windows are blasted out. There are bullet holes in the building from skirmishes taken earlier in the war. Another wonderful picture I love here is one that Cooley took of the 54th and 55th Regiments of the Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. This black infantry regiment was a cavalry unit, and they had all white officers and all black troops. And many of those soldiers settled in the Brooklyn area of Jacksonville after the war was over. And I love this photo. This is from the Library of Congress, also taken by Cooley. This 100-foot tower was at the corner of Pine Street and Forsyth, Pine Street being the old name for Main Street. And you see two members of the U.S. Signal Corps up in the air looking out for Confederate ships coming down the river, and they signaled similar signal towers at Yellow Bluff Fort and Mayport Mills to warn of approaching enemy. The enclosure up at the top of that, of course, was so the signal corps man could duck inside in case snipers came around and tried to shoot him on top of the tower. Here's a picture of Yellow Bluff Fort, originally founded by the Confederates and overtaken by the Union soldiers, heavily armed with very elaborate ammunition and firearms in this 1864 photo by Cooley. There were many ships on the river. The northern ships, like the USS Commodore pictured here, was actually converted from an old ferry boat and converted into action for the many gun battles that took place on the St. Johns River during the Civil War. Now, after the Civil War, all those soldiers who came to Jacksonville went home and told their friends about this fabulous place where they'd been stationed. And by 1869, 4 years after the war, Jacksonville was bringing many, many northern tourists to the city. Here you see some of the tourist boats filled with tourists going up and down the St. Johns River, and some of the hotels. This is St. John's House. St. John's House actually was started during the Civil War. There was a lovely woman named Eliza Hudnall who, when the Union gunboats were coming up the river, instead of fleeing, she loaded her boats with donuts and fried chicken and fresh eggs and took it to the Union soldiers. So they befriended her and protected her house from vandalism, and many of the Union soldiers stayed there. And I have many pictures of old hotels in Jacksonville. Here's the Mater House, and I'll show you some other photos in a minute, but the boats going up and down the St. Johns River were fabulous. There were like 150 different ships traveling the St. Johns River, bringing tourists to the city, and perhaps the finest of all of them was the city of Jacksonville. This great ship began its service in the 1880s and continued until the 1920s. Here you see the Nichols House. I love this photo. It has such a great picture of the people standing on the balcony and the taxi cab to bring guests for the hotel from the ferry docks to the hotel. Another great hotel was the Carlton. This was on Bay at Market Street. Was built in the 1860s and one of a dozen or more elegant hotels for Jacksonville tourists. The one with the best view, though, the panoramic view from the top of the Grand National Hotel on Bay Street, was where many great photographs of Jacksonville were taken from. This was later known as the Everett Hotel. The greatest hotel of all, perhaps the largest hotel in the South, was the St. James Hotel. Started out as a smaller 3-story building and grew to be this 5-story building that occupied a full city block opposite the city park, which was later named St. James Park. Here you see a rare look inside the St. James dining room with its waiters waiting to serve you. Now, tourists were here in the winter months from November to May. And so that's when the hotels were in blossom. And there was a promenade every evening with wealthy Northerners going from the hotel on the west, the Everett, all the way up to the Carlton Hotel on the east, showing off their finery. And here you see one of those tourists taking in the marvels of Jacksonville on Bay Street. And as a tourist, you could buy anything you wanted to in Jacksonville. Oski's novelty shop featured stuffed alligators, and here this giant sunfish. Just a remarkable picture to come to us from the 1870s. Here's another crystal clear picture showing the signage and this architecture, the modest architecture, I might add, of downtown Jacksonville, with the Everett Hotel in the far background of the picture. Another posed picture on the docks and the wharfs with Northerners mingling with local citizens. Now, all those wealthy Northerners gave the city a very sophisticated air, but just a few blocks away from the St. James Park and the great hotels was the muddy street of Bay Street. I mean, it was really pretty primitive, like a frontier town, shown here in the early 1870s, and in vivid contrast to sophistication just a few blocks away. The wooden sidewalks you see there protected the visitors' feet from the mud. And in 1886, the 6 blocks from Market to Julia Streets were paved with cypress blocks, which, although were an advantage, they had the disadvantage of often catching on fire or floating away when there was a heavy rain. And it wasn't until 1893 that Bay Street was paved with vitrified brick. One of the northern visitors I most love was seen here in the center is General Francis Spinner. He was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury. Lincoln famously said, because of Spinner's fabulous ornate signature, that nobody could counterfeit the American money as long as he was the Secretary of the Treasury, because nobody could sign his name the way he could. And he had a house on Commercial Boulevard, which later became Riverside Avenue, but he spent his summers out at Pablo Beach for his health in this little tent city he built. This is a picture that's never been shown before either. This was a school, Duval Graded and High School, was the first high school for whites built after the Civil War, built in 1870 when this picture was taken. Not much of a building, but it's still, looking at out through time, it's pretty remarkable to see it. 2 years earlier, the school for black children had been built, Stanton School. Here you see it. And James Weldon Johnson, the famous statesman, orator, attorney, poet, and artist, went to school there, and it's probably in this picture. And later on, he became principal of Stanton, which time he wrote the so-called Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, that is celebrated so widely today. This is one of the most beautiful artistic photographs also of this era, the steamship Arapahoe pulling up to the Clyde Line steam docks around 1910. And the Clyde Line steamers started in the 1880s and continued to serve Jacksonville from northern ports, stopping in Charleston and New York until the 1920s. This elaborate looking scene down Main Street, then called Pine Street, it gets more interesting the more you look at it. The banner across the street says Jacksonville extends a hearty welcome, and that welcome was extended to President Grover Cleveland, his first visit to Jacksonville on February 22nd, 1888, to kick off the world's famous, at least famous in Jacksonville, Subtropical Exposition, our attempt to build a World's Fair to attract tourists back to Jacksonville who had started by the 1880s to go to other places like California due to the railroads and so forth, and St. Augustine and parts further south. But the picture has a little tiny portrait of President Grover Cleveland at the top up there, and you can look over the left and see the taxi cab driver asleep on the stagecoach waiting for some fares to take him out to the World's Fair on Main Street. And the trolley tracks you see in the center of Main Street there also carry them out to this fabulous, it was our Xanadu, the most elaborate building built in Jacksonville at that time, and probably up until the Great Fire of 1901. It had the main exposition hall and some smaller exposition halls over to the left. There was a campment of Seminole Indians, a lake with a giant alligator in it, and exhibits from all over the state of Florida. Another charming picture with children in the foreground, this great building. You notice on the sign over the door, it says 1887. They didn't quite get it finished in time, and it actually opened in January of 1888. And President Grover Cleveland came to visit a month later. Another interesting photo showing the Waterworks building at the time in front of the Subtropical Exposition building. The Subtropical Exposition was on Main Street at first, right where the Waterworks Park is today, if you know where that is. And over on the right, you see some of the houses that were along Main Street in Springfield. And if you read my book, Life, The Untold Story of Charles Adrian Pillars, he stayed in that fifth house from the front for a period of time when he first came to Jacksonville, and was rudely awakened when Big Jim, the steam whistle on the top of the waterworks blew for the first time, rattling the furniture. One last look at the Subtropical, probably the most exotic building built in Jacksonville anytime. And there were exhibits from all over the state of Florida. As I mentioned, every county had its representation there. And unfortunately, the Subtropical closed in 1891 after 4 seasons, and it was demolished in 1896. Here you see another rare photo. This is sometime in the late 1880s, early 1900s, of the medieval sport of jousting, which apparently was quite popular in Jacksonville at that time. By 1898, we had soldiers coming to Jacksonville, thousands of soldiers who were encamped here for the Spanish-American War. And this great picture of one of the parades of these early soldiers coming to town to take part in what Teddy Roosevelt called the Dandy Little War, a war where more people died of malaria than died of actual gunshot battle wounds. Two of the most photographed soldiers in Jacksonville were these mismatched vertically pair of George Hyacinth, who was 5'4", and George Jordan, who was 6'3", camped in Jacksonville. The first horse corral was set up in East Springfield neighborhood. Over on the right is Walnut Street. And you can see how sparsely settled Springfield was at that time. Soldiers from 16 states came to Jacksonville, and here you see the tent city set up by the 9th Illinois Volunteers. These young soldiers were, many of them in their late teens. You see this one, if you look carefully, you'll see him holding a pistol. And this was their first adult experience, many of them, and they got all set to go to battle. And the battle really never came about. The Spanish-American War was set to be the war of liberation of Cuba from Spain. And all those troops assembled here, and the war just sort of fizzled out, and many of them left without ever seeing battle. As I said, more of them died of malaria than died of battle. In fact, here's a rare picture seen for the first time here on this program of a soldier on stilts in the muddy bogs that made up Camp Cuba Libre in Springfield. And many of the soldiers left and went to Panama Park or moved out to Pablo Beach to get away from the mosquito-ridden swamp that was around Ionia Street. Here you see some troops marching along Ionia Street. You can see some Springfield houses in the background there. And some soldiers marching at their encampment out at Pablo Beach, which of course later became Jacksonville Beach. Probably the most beautiful photograph of this era that's in the Jacksonville Historical Society archives is the Peace Jubilee that came at the end of the Spanish-American War. This was in Riverside Park, and this tableau of Uncle Sam surrounded by young, beautiful women in their flagged costumes was a very great celebration in Riverside Park, attended by thousands of people. I love this photo. Now, the next series of photos we have are of the Great Fire of Jacksonville, and to see more of those, I hope you'll go to the book that we did on the fire. But this was taken by a guy named George Chapin, who photographed some pictures during the fire. And here you see the fire actually started around 12:30 over in La Villa, far to the left of this photograph you're watching on your screen. About 12:30 at the Cleveland Fiber Factory, and the fire spread quickly. This photograph was about 3:30 as the Great Windsor Hotel and the St. James Hotel caught on fire. You see the park that's now St. James Weldon Johnson Park on the far right. And there was a series of pictures taken by an unknown photographer. Here you see the parish house at Immaculate Conception catching on fire at about 4:30 in the afternoon. And there are 6 of these photos taken by the same photographer. We can tell they were the same photographer because they all have that white stripe at the bottom. It's a light leak of the camera. But this photographer took amazing pictures. And here you see the Dr. Stolenwork's house, picture taken from the top of his balcony. He was at the corner of Laura and Adams Street. And surprisingly, even with all of this disaster going on around him, his house was in the 12 block area that did not catch fire. And here is the photo of the century as far as Jacksonville goes. There's nothing else like it. This one photographer, the same one who had a light leak in the camera that I've cropped off the bottom of this picture, caught this moment of terror as Jacksonville is burning down and people are fleeing into East Jacksonville across the Duval Viaduct. Just the look of horror and the magnitude of the fire is captured in this photo like no other. And if you don't have a copy of the book, there are still copies of these available from the Jacksonville Historical Society. And this book is unique in that it tells the stories of people who were in the fire, interviews with over 100 people who were either in the fire or had notes from the fire that we captured. And it's remarkable to hear their stories of what happened on that horrible day. The day after the fire, Jacksonville was a wasteland, and you've seen many pictures of this deserted scene looking like a bomb had been dropped. And here's a picture you have not seen. This is shown for the first time tonight, a picture of burned out Jacksonville 2 days later from the river, showing a totally new perspective of the wasteland that was Jacksonville, the city of ashes. The great city armory was thought to be the most impregnable building in the city, made of limestone. And when it caught on fire about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it crumbled like an eggshell, he said. And it was a disaster. As the streets cooled a few days later, people began to walk down the streets trying to find anything that resembled their old city of Jacksonville. And they not only could not find their home, they couldn't even find their streets. Everything was like a ghost town. And this remarkable photo has just sort of a ghostly, dreamlike quality of that awful disaster. Another one of those haunting pictures reminded me of some of the photographs of World War II, of bombed out Germany. This is the Immaculate Conception Church, where the whole church was destroyed, but miraculously the statue of the Virgin Mary stood throughout the blaze. And here you see the National Guard troops walking the streets of Jacksonville. They were summoned by the governor to protect Jacksonville, but as they walked through the streets in their woolen uniforms in the hot May weather, they became quite agitated, and they drank a lot of alcohol and shot a lot of rounds that made them a nuisance more than a help. And the mayor politely asked them to leave Jacksonville after about 10 days and go back to Palatka and Green Cove Springs and other little towns where they came from. There was a commissary set up, several of them all over town, to feed the homeless and provide goods and garments. And the recovery of Jacksonville was just remarkable. Here you see a picture just exactly a week after the fire of one of the businesses that were back within a few days after the fire. This wonderful shot of the barber, Frank Crowd. He's seated there in the middle. He had a barbershop in the old Baldwin building on Bay Street, which burned, of course, but he had a new barbershop set up within a week after the fire. And his father there in the middle with the outrageous mutton chop whiskers came down from New York to help him build his new barbershop. The city built back quickly. This picture was taken less than 2 years after the fire. The great Windsor Hotel you see on the right actually was built shortly after the fire. The fire was May of 1901, and that building opened in February of 1902. And it had just freshly opened. You can see the banners on the window. So this picture was taken at a time when all of the buildings you see there had been built back in just barely a year. And I love this photograph taken in 1903. It was almost 2 years after the fire, to celebrate the city's rebuilding. This was taken by a woman named Leah Mary Cox, who took very artistic pictures of Jacksonville with the Windsor Hotel in the background, the two children in the buggy, the noble horse, and the very aristocratic looking African-American man standing there in the picture. It's just a lovely, lovely composition. Here you see the county courthouse, also rebuilt after the fire. It was built in 1902 at the cost of $100,000. It was torn down in the 1950s to make 8 parking places for police cars. Soon after the fire, the the skyline was changing rapidly. Here's the Bisbee building being built next to the old Florida National Bank, the Marble Bank, and now those two buildings are being resurrected as part of the Laura Street Trio. Klutho was an architect who came from New York and pioneered the construction of buildings with reinforced concrete, a brand new material. And you see the wooden scaffolding in this picture. And up in the top of the picture, you see a man standing, and that's Klutho. We have a series of these pictures as each story was built, and Klutho was standing in each one of those. Pretty amazing. Another lovely photo of the tourist car in front of the Seminole Hotel, also designed by Klutho. Wonderful vintage clothing. Perhaps one of the biggest splashes that came after the fire was Dixieland Park. This great amusement park superseded Disney World by many, many decades and was Jacksonville's Xanadu, its exotic place of entertainment. The Dixieland Park had rides. It had this big dance hall that also doubled as a skating rink. It was one of the many exotic buildings that had sort of a Moorish flavor in our amusement park. And here you see on the left the Dixie Dewdrop, a 160-foot slide. For a dime, you could go sliding down it, or for a nickel, you could get a scare at the Mystery House there in the center. Dixieland Park had some exhibition halls where the Florida Exposition was held. And I love this picture of people dressed up in their finest clothes walking through to see the expositions. And another photo this is unique. It is the first time-lapse photograph I know of in Jacksonville history, also taken by Leah Mary Cox of the exposition hall at night. Another great attraction was the Florida Ostrich Farm out on Talleyrand, and they had not only 200 of these exotic birds to look at, but the star was Oliver W., the world's only trotting ostrich that you see here in this picture. Another cool picture of downtown. This is Forsyth Street. In 1907, the Germania Club's annual parade, and I love the images of the streetcars with the elegant coach drivers on the left with their tall silk hats. Any one of these pictures could be in a museum, and including this one, which I love. It's a picture of a silent film actor. Jacksonville became, of course, the silent film headquarters of Florida from 1908 to about 1918. And the actor you see on the left is a fellow named Oliver Hardy, who came from Milledgeville, Georgia, to begin his film career. Here in a scene from a film shot on on Riverside Avenue, and the Lubin Studios that he worked for in Vim Comedies had a studio across the street. Another of the great film studios was Eagle Film Studios over in Arlington. They went bankrupt, and they produced a lot of comedies, but they went bankrupt and were purchased by Richard Norman, who established Norman Studios, which still exists in Arlington. That building in the background is still there and is one of the few silent movie studios left on Earth. The silent film actors were quite celebrities in town, but they also became a nuisance. They would often set a vacant building on fire and call the fire department to film the action of the fire and police coming, and then they ran like heck to get out of there. One of the great photos of the silent film era. And this is one of my favorite pictures of all time. It's colorized, but this was taken 100 years ago on June 30th, 1921, of the Acosta Bridge opening, the first bridge for pedestrians and automobiles to cross the St. Johns River. And here's the gala celebration on the day it opened. Another great attraction that was allowed by the Acosta Bridge was the development of the beaches. All of Southside had tremendous suburban growth after the bridge opened, but none was perhaps more popular than the beaches, that now that cars could get all the way to the beach. And here you see the great roller coaster in the background. It was inaugurated in 1928 and was torn down in 1950. I love this photograph too. This is the baptism at the swimming pool at Moncrief Springs. If you look over on the far right of the picture, you see a woman in white, and that's Eartha White. who was one of Jacksonville's most wonderful citizens. Another great photograph in our collection is this salvage operation on the North Jetties. They used dynamite to blast away at a sunken ship there to get it out of the water. And up came these three giant Jewfish. The scientific name is Atlantic Goliath Grouper, each weighing more than 400 pounds. And these are the Broward boys who were running the salvage operation. And on the next to the right, you see Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, shortly after he had retired as governor and just a few days before he died. Another beautifully artistic picture. I don't know who took this one. This is at the Strand Theater on Ashley Street. I call the picture Possibilities on Ashley Street, 1927, where you see a beautiful woman looking away from a man who's on the opposite side of the sign with a toothpick in one hand and a cigarette in the other, and all kinds of voluptuous thoughts running through his head. Or another picture of the wax and waves at NAS during World War II. They're truly our own Rosie the Riveter, maintaining and repairing the airplanes at the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville. My favorite pictures is this one of Dwight Eisenhower. He was a General Eisenhower then, campaigning for president, and he was so popular that before he gave the speech in Hemming Park, thousands of people lined the street from Imus Airport to greet the general during his campaign for president. Even more famous, perhaps, later was this guy, Elvis Presley. But this picture is not from his famous concert at the Florida Theater. This was a year before that. In July of 1955, he performed at the Jacksonville Baseball Park. And he was fourth billing under Andy Griffith, Marty Robbins, and Pearl and Husky when he played there. But he was such a hit that the young girls chased him after the concert, and he was greeted by one of his rabid fans here. Her name was Artist Clausen, enjoying his attention after the concert. Just a couple of days after the Hurricane Dora ravaged the city, the fabulous Four Beatles came to the city and performed in the Gator Bowl. They put on a concert for 20,000 screaming fans, but it almost didn't happen. At the last minute, the Beatles refused to perform at the Gator Bowl because it was segregated. And they convinced the city fathers to integrate the stadium, and they performed after all. Perhaps the most famous picture of Jacksonville everywhere is this Pulitzer Prize winning picture taken by news photographer Rocco Morabito in 1967. Morabito was out to shoot a labor protest when he came upon the scene of a stricken JEA lineman and his rescuer. He called for help and then took the picture, which appeared in newspapers all around the world, and the lineman did survive. Another great photo is this one of 1982 of Dizzy Gillespie headlining the Mayport and All That Jazz Festival. This was one of the great cultural attractions of Jacksonville that now takes place downtown. Another lovely, lovely photo of a hot air balloon in the morning mist rising over the new Napoleon Bonaparte Broward Bridge, now known as the Dames Point Bridge by most people. And this picture was taken September 24th, 1988, when the bridge was opening to traffic. It was the largest concrete cable-stayed bridge in the world, and I think one of the most beautiful bridges in the world, even today. And this is a picture of Mark Brunell, who was the first quarterback for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and led our team to a league playoff berth in the second year of the team. Kind of makes you wish we were back there now. There's so many great portraits. I'm just going to highlight a few as we close. This one is Ellie Weems. He was quite a talented artistic photographer in the Black community. And this is an artistic portrait of him taking a portrait of someone else. And as we look at these portraits of some of the people who have graced Jacksonville, here this fireman in the 1870s dressed up in his formal uniform, quite a sight in apparel. And this picture of Nina Cummer in her lavish gardens, portrait taken in 1927. and a portrait of an unnamed boy. This was taken by a very prolific photographer named Jack Spotswood. And just the expression on this youth's face and the lighting is certainly a wonderful image. Chief Thomas Haney was the fire chief during the Great Fire of Jacksonville, but instead of being decried as a failure, he was a hero. And when he retired, when this picture was taken in 1926, he was the longest serving fire chief in Jacksonville history. And I love this portrait of Miss Emily Jackson on her 102nd birthday, taken at the Clara White Mission, where the friends gathered to celebrate her 102nd birthday. This was taken by Ellie Weems, the photographer we saw a moment ago. And another picture by Weems of Joseph E. Lee. He was a lawyer, judge, a civil rights leader, and served in the House of Representatives and the Florida State Senate, and played an important role in the Great Fire of Jacksonville recovery, as well as in the civil rights movement. Mayman Jennings, shown here, moved to Jacksonville when her husband, the governor, William Jennings' term as governor ended, but she became more famous than her husband, the governor, as a crusader for women's suffrage, historic preservation, saving the Everglades, and she was named one of the 50 most important Floridians of the 20th century. Another amazing photograph, this one of Reverend Henry Harrison. He was a slave from Amelia Island Plantation who lived to be 118, and he was related to Clara White, whose daughter, Eartha White, he suggested her name and gave her a name, Eartha Mary Magdalene White. Here's a picture of Eartha White. She was known as an angel of mercy. Her life was dedicated to underprivileged and fervent humanitarianism, and was given a special award by President Nixon in the White House in 1970. She died at the age of 97 in the early 1970s. And this eccentric character, Willie Brown, is one of my favorites. He lived alone in the woods on a 361-acre pristine plot of land overlooking the marshes east of Fort Caroline. And for years before he died in 1970, developers were always pestering him to sell him their land, this wonderful area of land. And instead, I think just to piss him off, he willed the property to the Nature Conservancy. And it's now part of the Theodore Roosevelt area of the Timaquan Preserve. Another noteworthy citizen who you may not recognize, he was Charlie Haas Singletary. He was sort of the mayor of La Villa when the great Harlem Renaissance was going on in the north. And this was when the jazz era was happening in Jacksonville. He's standing on the corner of Ashley and Broad Street. You can see Old Stanton High School in the background. He's famous for writing the song Strangers in the Night. And he wrote many songs for Elvis, Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, and others. And here's a picture of Leah Mary Cox that I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to close the presentation with just a little bit about her and her work, because she is so special. She came to Jacksonville she was born in England and came here with her family in 1888. And in the late 1890s, she began to take pictures just as a hobby. Her profession was as a milliner, a hat maker. And yet she lugged this huge camera all around Jacksonville, taking pictures not just of scenes of the city, but artistic portraits and scenes of her friends and family. And she was a great photographer and an artist as well, as you'll see by the composition of some of her photos. She was inclined to dress some of her subjects flamboyantly to have this wonderful interplay of light and dark and charm. And this picture is just one of the most amazing everyday scenes you'll ever see in your life, dancing in the attic in a house on Church Street with the Victrola in the background and the ladies dancing with each other with the children looking on. An amazing artistic portrait. Here's a picnic with many of her friends celebrating somewhere in the outskirts of Jacksonville. A playful but wonderful composition. Or the newlyweds walking into their new home with wonderful little details. I especially love the elaborate furnace on the right. She had a special affinity for children and took many, many children photographs. and just an ordinary scene of a Victorian living room with old folks. Now, you may wonder, how do we get all these photographs? Leah Mary Cox died in the 1950s, and almost 30 years later, a box of photos of hers were discovered in a basement in Fairfax Manor by her grandniece, Susan Masucci, and her husband, Ron Masucci, and they donated 4,000 glass plate negatives to the Jacksonville Historical Society. They have wonderful photographs like this one of young women in their white gowns standing beside the lake at Riverside Park, or a young man and his young baby, or these great little expressions on the face of these children with their goats, or an old blind Confederate veteran with his grandchildren hovering in his lap, or exotic young women. She was a genius and an artist, and Mary Lee Cox caught these wonderful pictures that showed life in that time as it was and will never be again. As a hat maker, she befriended some of the movie stars at silent movies, and this one was Mabel Page, who bought her hats from Leah Mary Cox and became one of Leah's great friends. Posing here is Mabel Page, the film star, in her vamp outfit designed by Leah Mary Cox. And I'll close with this one. This is a shot that is obviously, you can tell, taken in April of 1920, that shows everyday life with beautiful trappings of just an ordinary kitchen with a woman at the ironing board at the window for light. And the composition is so perfect and the lighting is so amazing that this will endure forever, hopefully hundreds of years from now, even after these people are gone, that these will be preserved in the archives of the Jacksonville Historical Society. And the photos of Leah Mary Cox and all the other photographers who came before her to capture images of this city not only show us an insight into where we've come from, but to maybe inspire us in the future that this great city of Jacksonville can be even greater, and remember its history and also preserve that which is beautiful in our past, that we can have a more beautiful future. And part of this bicentennial celebration makes us recall that this dynamic must be preserved. If we don't preserve it now, our heritage can be so easily lost. So thank you for sitting through my little presentation. I hope you enjoyed going back through a trip through time in Jacksonville. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Wayne. That was just marvelous. And Jacksonville is very, very lucky to have somebody like you as a historian and a collector, and so willing to share it with us, both in your books and in presentations like this.
Thank you.
Speaking of books, Dr. Wood mentioned several of them today. The Jacksonville Family Album and the Great Fire of 1901, which you can purchase. You go to jackshistory.org and look for the shop tab. You will be able to get into our online bookstore and purchase those books. And Dr. Wood has graciously agreed to autograph any books that you buy that he has authored. And so what we will do is, if you do that, we will get them over to Dr. Wood. He'll sign them, and then we will either ship them to you or you can pick them up at the office.